Hello, I'm Ranaldo. I'm standing in the doorway of the Schippershof Museum in Menen, Belgium, where my show Lost Ideas is currently on view. And we're going to take a little walk through the show, and I'm going to discuss a few of the things on the wall and what's here on exhibit. Come on in. So we're standing in the atrium of the museum. And this is the wall text about the Lost Ideas show. The curator is Jan van Woensel, who was very integral in putting this show together with me, as well as the director of the museum, Giel Vandenberg. And this is a view of the main space here. We start with some elements of music. We've got a work for 8 or 9 speakers that are spread throughout the space here that have intermittent sound pieces on them. And we've got a hanging guitar here that is, maybe it's not on, it is on right now, which the general public is invited to play. I did a performance on in the opening night as part of the events of the opening night weekend. And the idea of this show really is to take a look at a bunch of works from me, starting, I think the earliest works are in the mid-70s. There's a couple works from the mid-70s while I was still at university or just past university days, and looking at a selection of works right up until about 2015 or 2016. So a wide variety of different activities that I've done in the visual art world in that period of time. So behind me here is Chinese Crowd. It's an oil painting or an ink painting on canvas of a crowd scene that I snapped when Sonic Youth was first in China the first time. So those were some of the guys at the front of the stage. So, let's give the guitar a swing and go upstairs. Let's go. So this is the main room on the ground floor. We've got a wall painting of one of my my Lost Highway drawings on the wall here, and a vellum piece with a portrait of Sandy Denny over here. Guitar player from Fairport Convention, beautiful singer. On this black wall, we've got images from my Lost Highways series. These are early works in this series when they were still predominantly horizontal works. So this is a selection of works that I do mainly when I'm on tour, traveling around playing music, sitting in the front seat of the car, making impressions of the highway as we travel. So they're done at speed, at 60 miles an hour, it's at 100 kilometers an hour going down the highway. So they're mainly improvisations jumping off from landscapes, and they're set all over the world, quite frankly. Let's see, this one is, well, that one just is Europe. But they're done in a bunch of different places, to Amherst, Massachusetts, to Lyon, to Arlon, all over the world. Just an activity that I've done. To San Francisco. We've got a couple spinning turntables. We recreated some painted records and made some new ones actually that I had done originally in the mid-80s when Sonic Youth was making our very first video for Death Valley 69. I painted some records that we had on turntables and filmed, and so we thought it was a nice idea to recreate some of these records here. This room also has a piece that was originally done in Paris in 2009 called Old News. It was an examination of newspaper imagery, because a lot of my works at that time were dealing with newspaper imagery. So I was cutting and pulling a lot of images out of the newspaper and trying to divorce them from the headlines around them and just see them as images. And so we made this work called Old News, where every few days new images are ripped out of the newspaper and placed on top of the old ones. And so it's a shifting grid of newspaper images divorced from the original papers and articles that they were attached to, so that they live a little bit of a life on their own, separated from the news around them, so they can be just seen as images. Political images, cultural images, just a random selection of the many images we're bombarded with every day in our world, I guess. On the far corner there's a video screen that's showing a sequence of 2 videos in repetition. One of them is called Sight Unseen. It's the footage from my partner Leah Singer that we use in performance when we perform live concerts, and it's a film that she created. And the other sequence that's on this monitor is a performance called Blind Performance, which was one of 10. It was the only executed performance from a stack of 10 pages of proposals I made for performance. And for this one, it involved 2 drummers and myself, and we were all blindfolded and led out to the stage, so none of the musicians could see what any of the other musicians were doing, or even at some points where the front of the stage was. And that's the other sequence that's on this monitor. It'll play later. Let's go upstairs. Okay, this is another piece created in Paris in 2008 and 2009. This is a large monotype called Oceanic, and it's an image of a diver, an Olympic diver, I think, and then it has the hand-lettered words on top. It's a monotype done on a press in the Paris print shop, large-scale monotype. This room exhibits my work with Leah Singer called Drift. It's the performance piece that we did throughout the 90s, from the time we first met until about 2005, when we made an exhibition about this work, and as part of the exhibition we fixed a DVD program that represented the work. It didn't show the performance aspect of it, so you don't see me with the guitar, but it's mostly about the film imagery that Leah was working with at the time. She was shooting 16mm film in a very unorthodox way in a 35mm still camera, and then using specially equipped analytical projectors to manipulate the films live. So we created, and we were working with a double screen format at the time. And so this is mostly about, I think it's about an hour-long program of the Drift film. So this room here exhibits a bunch of early works and scattered ephemeral pieces. There's a couple of vitrines full of many of the various book publications that I've done over time, and a couple of specific prints, some magazine collages that were done in the 90s on tour, on Sonic Youth's tour buses as we traveled around Europe. A couple of different print works. This guitar here is called the Moonlander, and it was created by a fellow from Holland called Yuri Landman, and he made it especially for me. It's got a bunch of different pickups and strings, and it's an experimental guitar, one of many that he's made, and Yuri was also featured in the opening weekend ceremonies for the opening of the museum show. A bunch of different works here, everything from painted lyric sheets to some photos from newspapers, drawings from the Southwest. I would like to point out this one in particular because a lot of the works we looked at downstairs were part of this Lost Highway series, where I'm sitting in the front seat of vehicles and sketching the road, and it's become one of my dominant activities in the current years. And the first evidence of it was this small 3-color print that was made in 1977 or 1978 when I was still in university and trying to learn multicolor techniques on etching plates. And so on a trip to Florida with a buddy of mine, I was sketching some highway images and turned one of them into this piece here. So this is really the very origin of all this work I've been doing right now with the sketching of the highways. And so it's kind of nice that it's here in the show. So now we come to the main rooms on the second floor. There's a lot of different things going on in these rooms. Maybe we'll take a walk around and have a look at some. Let's start right over here with this guitar piece. This is the first, there's 3 guitar pieces in this show that include video monitors in the sound holes. These were guitar pieces that I made in the mid to late 90s into the early 2000s. And rather than ship over from New York the 3 guitars that I had made originally, we made new versions of them here in Menen. So this is a second version of the very first video guitar piece I did, and it's called Lost Highway No. 1, and it's playing off this idea for a musician of the lost highway, stemming back to Hank Williams' song of the same name, and just playing off the idea in general of musicians have of road imagery and the way the road figures in the mythical nature of what a musician does. So this is an old Stella guitar with an image of a moving highway in the sound hole, and that's all it is. It's a silent image. We'll see 2 more of these guitars as we walk through this floor. Over the fireplace, there's a couple different things. A piece called Countless Centuries. It's a quote from a Godard movie that was done in Paris some years ago. A scratched record, which is a plate for one of the types of black noise record prints that I make, which we'll see in a minute. Chinese Empress. Another spinning record. And a portrait of a group from Scandinavia called Tradgras Stenar. I just like the image of these 4 figures in this snowy landscape. You can kind of tell it's a rock band, but it's it could be anything happening there. But I really like the photo, and so I thought I'd recreate it. A couple more pieces on vellum over here. Piece adapted from an early 20s German poster of a girl with projections on her body, and Arab woman with a hijab. Hijab? Is that how you say it? Hijab. This monitor is showing a sequence of 6 or 7 different video pieces that I made over time. Right now it's showing a piece called Book of Dreams, which was a visit to Jack Kerouac's grave in Lowell, Massachusetts in 91 or so. Myself and Steve Shelley went to visit his grave, and this was filmed with one of those toy cameras that they made originally for children that many artists adopted, called the Pixel Vision camera. So this particular video, which is also some of the imagery seen on the guitar piece that we saw, was filmed in Pixel Vision. But there's 5 or 6 different video pieces of mine on this monitor here, just in a rotating loop. Here on this corner wall we have 2 very, very early pieces. These were done probably in the year right after I moved to New York and started playing music in New York from Binghamton, New York, where I went to university. And I was doing a lot of work studying figures and trying to figure out how to interpret figures in a modern day. I was looking at things like Robert Longo's Men in the Cities pictures that were happening around that time, and Robert was an acquaintance of mine when I first moved to New York, and I was very impressed with his figures and trying to adapt what I was doing with figurative work to some new ideas. So these were 2 early versions of figures that I was working on in that period of time, 1981, 1982. And the last thing in this room, oh, there's a couple more things in this room here. This is another large monotype. This one was created at the same time as the oceanic monotype that we looked at earlier. It's a protest scene from Southeast Asia, I think from Indonesia. I'm not really sure, but it's called Mythic. And it was part of a series of these large-scale monotypes I was making using images cut out of the newspaper and trying to reinterpret them and represent them. Couple very loosely rendered drawings of Icelandic landscapes from the first visit I made to Iceland when we traveled around the country quite extensively, and I was stopping to sketch where I could in a small notebook and then later making enlargements from it. And a couple more monotypes made at the Canaille studios outside of Paris, part of a sequence I was working with of tree images, trees and leaves. This is a piece I made in homage to both the composer Steve Reich and the artist Robert Smithson. The formal nature of it is based on a Robert Smithson piece that I own a copy of. He made a print work of he took a picture of this rubble, just a bunch of rocks and rubble basically, and he tore the print in quarters after it was printed, and then it was sold packaged in a little envelope. And I really, his work is really important to me, and I wanted to do something that spoke to that work of his. And so I made this piece when I first moved to the loft in New York, in Lower Manhattan that I live in right now. Steve Reich lived in the building and we became friends, and prowling around in the basement there I found these 4 Farfisa organs stacked up, and they were the organs that Steve Reich used in a piece that was very important to me that was called 4 Organs from from around 1972 I think. And there they were. This piece had been so incredibly important to me, and here I moved into this building, and the 4 organs, along with a bunch of his other musical equipment, were stacked up in a corner. So I made a bunch of images of these 4 organs and later decided to use that in one of those images to make this combined homage to Steve and Robert Smithson. And it's also torn in quarters and sold packaged in a little glassine envelope like the original. Another tree monotype here. This piece over the fireplace is not the complete set, but it's part of a set of Xerox generated works based on an image of Madonna. And if you look at the top left corner, that's the original. That's a Xerox of the original photo that must have been pulled out of a magazine. And then I just kept copying the copy to see what kind of generation would happen, and you can see that it gets more and more distorted and deteriorated with each successive generation. At the time, this was made in a studio called Sear Sound, utilizing their copy machine while Sonic Youth was making our sister record, so that would have been around 1986. Madonna's popularity would have been very high, and I was making a lot of art that involved Xerox copies. And I was also involved just in from a musical standpoint in this idea of, you would take tapes out of the studio and then you'd make a copy of the tape, and the copy would always be considered a little bit less inferior. Or if you were a collector of bootlegs, sometimes you'd get a copy of a copy of a copy, and with the attendant distortion. And this piece sort of makes visible what happens when that if that process continued. You can see from a very clear image at the top, it's changed. It's an analog process, so it changes with every subsequent copy that's made. And I was fascinated by that idea, and I just wanted to see how far I could take it. These are early record works from my Black Noise series. This is a series that started in Paris in 2007 and 2008. I started making scratchings on old vinyl records and then pulling print editions of them like you would any other dry point. And I found these large format records. They're 16 inches as opposed to a normal album, which is 12 inches. and they were used by American radio stations in the 50s, and I really liked the size of them, and so I started doing a bunch of prints on those. This is actually just a test print of one of them, and this is one of an edition of a different plate. So there'll be some more of those we'll see in a minute. Actually, let's go across the way here and talk about those right now. I'll talk about records. Well, here's a bunch more of these record prints. Now, for instance, this one here is the ghost print of one we looked at over there. These two kind of go together, this one and the one on the wall over there. The second prints were made without adding any additional ink. You roll the ink on, you wipe the plate perfectly, you make a print. It's very dark black, like the one we saw before. And then before doing anything else, you just roll the plate through the press again and make a second print, because there's still a bunch of ink left. So I've got these doppelgangers, you might say. You can put these two prints next to each other and they're exactly the same, except for the quality of the ink and the light. And the ghost images, as we call them, have a more of a silvery quality rather than the deep jet black of the originals. Here's a couple more. These were made in the Villa Arson in Nice in south of France in 2014. And here we have a piece called A Way Out of History. It's a mastering disc, that's why there's no grooves on it. It's the kind of plate that's used in a mastering studio to make an album. And I acquired some of these plates and was making different works with them. And in this case, I don't know how much to interpret what it says, a way out of history, but sometimes music or art in general can be a way into history or a way out of history. You can find artworks or music from any different period, and when it's there for you when you're ready to discover them, and it almost doesn't matter what period of time they were made in. When they come to you and hit you and affect you, then they become part of your own experience. And so I made this work with this very bright light coming through the sound, through the spindle hole, and it's just a slowly spinning. It's a clock without any hands that doesn't keep time, or it doesn't keep time in a normal day-to-day way. Okay. Here's a small linoleum print of Skip James, old blues man. I was making a series of linoleum prints at one point. There will eventually be 13 when the series is done. It's not done yet, but this was the first one I made before the series started, when I was experimenting with the linoleum blocks. And I chose this image of Skip James and modified it a little bit and made a print out of it. Here's another guitar piece. This one is the second one. It's called Highway Song No. 2. And it's again a recreation of a guitar piece that is still in New York, with some added new elements. The original one doesn't have this painted facade on it, but we were looking through we were combing the internet for pictures of painted guitars, and I found one that looked like this, and I really liked it, so it was being used as a sign, you know, every Friday night and Saturday night, live music. And I really liked the way it sat on the guitar. The video piece here is a 45-minute loop of a scene from a movie Sonic Youth was shooting in 1986 when we were on tour in the United States behind our sister record. And we were lost in Columbus, Ohio, trying to find the club. This was before you could GPS on the internet or anything like that. We had some paper maps, and we were driving around Columbus, Ohio, trying to find this club on a street called High Street. And so this particular video is called Searching for High Street, and it's just a slice of on-tour life, living in a van with 5 or 6 other people, and scene from the sound hole of an acoustic guitar. In the center of this room, we've got a push cart with 3 different monitors on it, sort of, again, an arrangement of different video pieces. Each monitor has a looped sequence of 3 or 4, or sometimes just 1 or 2 videos. We were looking for an interesting way to display these, and the curator, Jan van Woensel, suggested the TVs came in on this cart, and we really liked the way they looked, so we thought we would put the video pieces on this cart. Obviously the sound is down right now, but they would all be with their attendant sounds. So there's some historical things. This is an abstract video piece that I made in the late 80s that I was performing on stage with, doing solo electric guitar. It's about a half an hour piece. I'm not really sure what's on each of these monitors, but this one here is a whole series of digital videos that I was shooting on stage during Sonic Youth performances, during the Jam performance. Whenever we were doing more abstract performance, I was picking up my digital camera and doing some shooting, and I made a series of 6 or 8 films shot live on stage during the middle of the performances. And this monitor has 5 or 6 different ones in succession, going around and around. And this one is also from Paris in the late 90s. Another artistic couple that was in residence at the studio had created this guitar with the multiple necks, and it was sitting in a white exhibition space. I didn't make the guitar, but I really was fascinated by it, and so at some point I chose to do a performance for camera only, not for audience, but just I spent an hour or 2 playing this crazy 6-necked guitar to see what I could get to happen with it. And I liked the way it looked, and I liked the stark nature of just one figure with this crazy guitar in a white room. The last room on this floor, which has a text piece here. We wanted to include a lot of text pieces in this show. This show was running concurrently with a show of works from the last year that were in Ghent in Belgium at the Jan Deze Gallery. So I had sort of simultaneously a show of my recent work, and in the museum here in Menen, a sort of a survey show of older works that have led up to the newest works. So there's a lot of different things going on in this room. There's a wall text. We decided we wanted a lot of wall text because a lot of my work deals with language. There's a couple pieces in this room with language as a component. This is one of a series of pieces called Letters from MM. My friend Michael Morley, a musician and artist who lives down in Dunedin, New Zealand, and I was pulling quotes out of letters from him and putting them on various mundane images and using his texts as my voice in this case, I guess you would say. So here's another one made in Paris. It's a monotype with stamped on lettering from their letter press, and it's again just a tree image and a random collection of cells. That was something I read in a newspaper, that some scientist was describing what a human is. Really, it's just a random collection of cells that then became more specified as our species evolved. And I thought that was an interesting concept, so I put that phrase on top of the work. The third of the guitar pieces is here. This one is called Highway Song Number 4. It's also called Glastonbury Fair, after the imagery in the video. The video imagery is taken from the very first Glastonbury Festival, which was released on DVD, and I grabbed a lot of the images from the DVD and created this hippie painted guitar. Again, this is a recreation of a guitar that I made in New York originally. And this one has a wall quote that goes along with it that is the hallucinogenic musings of a friend of mine that he sent to me on a cassette tape back in the late 70s. And it was a long rambling tape of my friend's friend during an acid trip, and he was talking into the microphone and just musing. He was, I guess, tripping pretty hard at the time. And he came up with this quote: "If you ever find yourself quite intoxicated, it's quite nice to look at a seashell. They have a depth of color and a strangeness of perfection, exceptionally beautiful and deep. Just think, through the ages, the life work of a tiny creature deep beneath the sea. I wonder if my life will ever reach such a degree of perfection." It's a sort of stoned rambling that had a kind of profundity to me, and I really liked it, and so I've taken to executing it on the wall to accompany this guitar piece in multicolor inks, so that it gets this kind of psychedelic, drippy look, and it goes along with this piece called Glastonbury Fair. This piece is called El Oído, which means the ear in Spanish, and on this side you can see there's a silkscreen of an ear, multicolor silkscreen on the box. At the time I made this piece, I was making multi-channel sound installations, and there was at the time a gallery in New York called Studio 5 Beekman that was set up specifically for sound works. That's all they exhibited were sound works. And I made a 10-channel sound work in this gallery, featuring mainly vocal excerpts, voices that I had recorded of friends, different people that I knew, some famous, some not, and then cut into that voices taken off records by, I don't know, Sylvia Plath or Carson McCullers or Raymond Carver or a bunch of other people, Robert Smithson. And it was sort of a multi-channel vocal collage where these different words that people were saying were interacting with each other and creating a sort of artificial conversation that never quite repeated twice because of the way the loops were. And around that time I was invited by a art library in Rotterdam called Vedute, and they are a library for artist books, and the one component of the book of the library is that every piece is this very shape. I don't know what the dimensions are exactly, but every piece in their collection is like this, like a book, so they can be shelved like a library. And some artists' works opened up, and there's an infinite variety of works that people have created for this library. But what I decided to do was do a boxed recreation of this sound work that I had created for Studio 5 Beekman. So there's speakers on a bunch of places on this box, and so this is a 4-channel sound work recreation of a work I did at Studio 5 Beekman Gallery in, I don't know, the early 90s, I guess it was, or mid-90s. And Vedute Library was kind enough to lend us that for the show. A few more pieces, 18 by 24 pieces. This one is called The Hitchhiker. Again, here's another one that's including some text on it, monotype of a tree. Lost Ideas, this is the piece that gives the show its title. And this is a rendering of a pavilion in Osaka, Japan, with, I think this is Stockhausen here in the center in the picture. It was, again, fittingly near the Vedute work, this was a pavilion that was created to exhibit multi-channel sound works. And so it was part of something called Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, like a World's Fair kind of situation with lots of different pavilions. And this domed pavilion was designed and with the help of Stockhausen, and it was multi-channel speaker dome where different composers created works for it. And then the last piece, well, there's a couple more pieces here in the show. Let's look at this one first. This one is in an odd place here at the top of the stairway from the Lost Highways room. And this piece is called Core. And it's one of the most, to me, one of my most successful pieces with incorporating some of my abstract poetry on top of a canvas. And it's got this figure, this nude figure from the back. I think it's from a Spanish painting, I'm not really sure. And it's got a piece of one of my internet spam poems. I was making poems based on spam that I was getting on the internet, which was just lots of words in random orders without any sense to it, and I was taking these words and modifying them further and making a series of sort of surrealistic poems from them. So this is one, and we liked the idea, or I liked the idea, that it sat in this strange place with this window. So when you're in the atrium, you can see this figure behind the window, and it has this kind of interesting play with the window. So the window is actually should be a permanent part of the work. In a way, I really love the way this piece looks right here in this very strange little corner. And then the last piece of the show is at the top of the staircase to the attic here, and it's a double screen presentation of a piece of mine that's called LS in Central Park, and it's my partner Leah Singer filmed on Super 8 in the early 90s in Central Park in New York, and it's very much a portrait of her and of the day that we spent together, and very much in 1993 it says. It's very much in the spirit of a lot of the American avant-garde cinema greats that I studied with in school, Stan Brakhage and Jonas Mekas, Ken Jacobs. All that was my background in cinema. So when I started making cinematic portraits, they were intended to be more like the way poetry functions, as opposed to the way a film that you go to see that has a narrative. These films weren't telling a story, they were abstract, and they were about visual sensation and yeah, visual sensation, I guess. So it's a 3-minute portrait of Leah in Central Park that then we've got spread across 2 different monitors just to give it an added dimension, and we placed it at the top of the stairs here because we liked the way that fulfilled the piece a little bit.